an example of how to use threads for some tasks that it's a little bit more meaningful than in the intro video to threads. If you have not watched the intro video to threads that I have, please watch it or watch one introductory video so then you can understand this example a little better. So let's look over what the example is. It's a class called compute scores. It'll compute the average of scores of two arrays. So what it does, I have a main method which happens to be the main thread, right? So that's the first thread that a program will always run in Java, right? If I run a separate thread, then that's a second thread, and so on. So in my main method, I have two arrays of doubles, scores 1 and scores 2, and they have room for 10,000 double values. Now, I also have, before going into the main method with more detail, I have two other methods here and here, right? I have a fill scores that receives an array of doubles and a number that I will use as an identifier. And what this does is it says for I equals 0 to the length of the array, here's what's going to happen. What's going to happen is that I'm going to assign a random number to that position of the array. And what I will do here is that I will divide the length in 10 chunks, and at each one of those chunks, it will say, filled whatever number of rows in, and then the identifier of the array. Okay. Now this is fill scores. Basically, just fills an array of doubles with random values. That's what it does, and then it prints along the way. It prints some tracing along the way. Now, here's this other method, AVG, and it receives an array of doubles. It basically computes the average. It returns the average. This is your standard average function with an accumulator, sum equals 0, and it's going to go through the array, adding the numbers in the array to that sum. And then in the end, it'll just return that divided by the number of elements of the array or the length of the array. So this is fill out random scores, compute the average of one array. Fill one array, compute the average of one array. Now let's go back to the main. I have two such arrays, scores 1 and scores 2. And I'm gonna, from the main thread, I'm gonna span another thread, right? A new thread. Now the thread, as we've seen in the previous video, right? The constructor of a thread receives any object of type runnable, but also a lambda expression, which is the syntax with the open close parentheses, arrow, and open curly braces. If you want to know more about lambda expressions, I have another video that talks about that. But so in this thread, what we're going to do is we're going to fill the scores of the first array, and this number 1 is just to say that's the first array, is an identifier. Once we fill the scores, we're going to print done with scores 1. Then I'm going to compute the average of the first array, and then I'm going to print the average 1 is whatever, right? That's going to be the task, what I'm going to do in my thread, and then I call the start method of the thread to start running it. In the meantime, the main thread is going to do the exact same thing for array 2. It's going to fill the scores of array scores 2 with identifier 2. Then it's going to print done with scores 2. Then it's going to compute the average of scores 2, and then it's going to print that average. So there's two threads running here. One is the main thread, and the other one is this thread that we run. And they will both compute averages on two arrays. This is a good example of what threads can do. Usually when you can do things that do not require sequence but can be done in parallel, like computing averages of two very independent arrays, threads are a good choice. So let's compile this and run it. And as you can see here, oops, I had another screen there. As you can see here, first by filling the arrays, started filling the rows of array 1, then array 2, then it continued filling array 2 because that one ended earlier than array 1 because it's threads. It's the CPU is assigning slices of time for each of these threads to run, and because we have not prioritized any of these threads, the CPU prioritizes them however it wants, right? With some algorithms. So you can see that sometimes some arrays are filled sequentially, sometimes it's just, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. And then done with scores 1 and scores 2. But then, so this printout of filling, it was done earlier with scores 1, and then it was done filling the scores 2. But in computing the averages, apparently the averages of array 2 were computed before those of array 1. These are basically two filling of arrays and computing averages that are happening at the same time. And that is a decent example of what threads can do and what they can be used for. Imagine sorry, I'm just closing windows here. But imagine this example, or these tasks being two parallel tasks. This is widely used in big data, this parallelism. If you want to copy the code and run it, copy this code. Just make sure that to close this last curly brace at the bottom. Whoops. To close the curly brace at the bottom. Okay. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned. There's more on threads.